Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, the ancient Mayan prediction wasn't about the end of the world, as we can confirm it now, but it was rather about the end and maybe more pointedly, the beginning of a new age. Here in the month of January, that certainly seems poetic and appropriate. Welcome again to the most widely watched program on Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris Williams. So with the acute part of the fiscal cliff behind us now, we face the tedious task of teasing out what affects this new age and new direction of broad programs like the federal sequestration, the Affordable Care Act, the new tax landscape, and oh yeah, the national debt we'll have on us now. Anita Brown-Graham from Institutes of Emerging Issues and Cheryl Richards from Northeastern University will start our dialogue. And later from North Carolina's Triangle, tech CEO Stephen Wiehe.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, health care, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising health care costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded January 11th, 2013. On this week's program, Anita Brown-Graham of North Carolina State University, Dr. Cheryl Richards of Northeastern University, and special guest Stephen Wiehe, President and CEO of SciQuest, Inc. Now, Chris Williams.
Hello, welcome to our program. My apologies, Cheryl Richards. I almost said Roberts in the front of the show, and I did. And Anita, how many times, and this has nothing to do with anything, but how many times do people call you Anita Graham Brown?
All the time. I think somehow it rolls off the tongue more smoothly than Brown Graham.
How's your husband feel about that?
He's gotten used to being called Mr. Brown Graham, okay. So, it's all the same.
Well, welcome. Good to have you both here. We're going to talk about education. Here we are in a new year, and specific, at least in for our North Carolina viewers, a new sheriff in town in the executive mansion. The Republicans have solidified their control of the House and the Senate. Anita, is there going to be some new direction in education policy here? And I mean broad education policy, K through 12 and higher ed as well.
I think absolutely so. It's interesting that you started this show talking about moving beyond the acute period of the fiscal cliff debate. I actually think we're not beyond it, because the real conversation is, how do we expand our economy? And I think increasingly every conversation about education policy in North Carolina and beyond is going to be, are we preparing a new generation of workers who really are able to not just create jobs and increase productivity, but expand wealth and revenue so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where there are more bills to be paid by government than there actually is revenue available to be collected.
Okay, so thank you for bringing that up, because let's talk about this for a second. And Cheryl, you're going to need to jump in here on this one. So when North Carolina, and I'm not going to compare it to South Carolina right now, but when North Carolina is creating half the number of jobs that they need to be creating, and third slowest in the nation at doing that, by the way, it's a dubious measure for North Carolina. Anita, is this education investment, is this the most critical thing we need to be doing for North Carolina?
I think there's no question that it is important to consider the investment, but what's more important is to make sure that the investment is offering the returns that are economic returns. So how interesting that the UNC system, with its recent Strategic Directions Committee, has been absolutely focused on, are we aligning the resources and the outputs, that is the graduates of our public university system, with the needs of the economy? it may not have been the first time that the UNC system
or was this something they were addressing?
That is absolutely what they were addressing. It was the #1 goal of this committee. It's what they've been talking about all fall. It's where their recommendations are going for this spring. And every one of our 17 campuses are going to have to respond in a way that is very different from our historical responses, but what the responsibility of universities are with respect to return on investment in the economy.
Okay, so Cheryl, do public, UNC system certainly, but do the private schools need to think very hard about the output of the education now and how it applies to what this new world economy thing is?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, and I don't think it's whether you're public or private or you're K-12 or community college or postdoctoral institution, you have to be relevant to the industries that you're serving. And so, your comment, Anita, about we're going to have to look at things differently. We're going to have to, I don't think there's a prescription of one size fits all. I think that's how education was originally formed. We have the one-room schoolhouse and we serve our communities, and then let's take what works in this schoolhouse and let's replicate it 16 times over and see if it works. And the reality is that what works in Greensboro is not necessarily what works in Wilmington, which is certainly not relevant in Charlotte. So I think institutions of higher education and public education too have a real challenge at their forefront now, which is how do we instill lifelong skills of students who want to learn and who want to continue learning, because the reality is they're probably not going to stay in Charlotte, they're probably not going to stay in the RTP area. They might find themselves in, I don't know, pick a country, right?
Okay, well,
so you have to constantly be reinventing education.
So where does it start? Where does this customization start? Does it start in K through 12?
Well, I think everybody recognizes it doesn't start in universities.
Right.
It really does have to start before then. And it's been very interesting to me, for example, this spring to go across North Carolina, trying to get a good feel for what's happening in manufacturing in the state of North Carolina. And talking to manufacturers and expecting them to say, our public policy challenges are about regulation, they're about taxation. #1, #2, #3 challenge, all about the workforce, finding employees with the right set of skills. So at a time when North Carolina was facing double-digit unemployment, we had employers saying, we can't find people to fill the jobs we have.
So does that mean they need a 4-year degree?
I think not all. So what's very interesting just in the manufacturing sector is there is a difference between what is necessary for the job on the factory floor and what is necessary for other jobs that support manufacturing. What manufacturers have said is, we're facing a shortage in both categories. We need people who have 2-year degrees, who have specialized training. We need to work with our community colleges to make sure that that training is customized for our particular industry. But we also do need more people with 4-year degrees.
Absolutely.
Daryl Statt from the South Carolina Technical College System was here a few weeks ago. Scott Rawls has been on this program from the North Carolina Community College System saying the same thing. Are we empowering these technical and community colleges enough? Do we push enough toward them to let them do their job? I mean, Cheryl, you worked for a community college for a while.
Well, the community college system in North Carolina is very diverse. So you have institutions that are a couple hundred.
But are they funded well enough?
Well, I think that's the point. And Anita and I were talking about this, before we started airing, is you have community colleges that serve 200-300 students. And then you have an institution like Central Piedmont Community College that serves 70,000. So you have an economy of scale that obviously, goes across there. But if you had Tony Zeiss sitting here on this show, he would tell you the state doesn't give any funding for new programs. And so he has become masterful in going out and asking industry, what do you need? And when you can define what you need, now help me fund it. Because that's the challenge for many of the public institutions right now. There really isn't enough funding to start new programs that will respond to the changing industry needs. And one of the other things I think that we're at a critical time right now in education overall. You asked the question about the skills gap and the unemployment figures. If you start to dissect those, you see that unemployment is higher with the least amount of education, right? So if you are a high school dropout, your unemployment rate is in the 15–16%. If you have a baccalaureate degree or higher, it's probably down in the 3 to 4%. So we as a society have this challenge now. That is what it is today. That's the known, and we have to address that. And the conundrum is that we don't necessarily need all baccalaureate trained individuals, although there are jobs for them now. So we've got to bring that into balance.
You know, I've heard that statistic a lot, and I wonder how much of that is that the higher skilled, the more educated workers end up with, you know, there's a finite number of jobs, finite number of positions. How many, you know, we don't have time to take that up. Let me give you the last word on this, Anita. So let me understand something. In North Carolina, there is a big push for tax reform. And the Republicans are talking about some meaningful tax reform. They'd like no income tax, and they'd like consumption-based. So should they be focused different? Do you think that this is a road they need to go down, or is there something we're missing on education?
So I think the two conversations are not discrete. Clearly, we need to think about tax reform in a way that also allows us to have enough revenue at the end of the day to fund basic roles of government, including educating its people. That said, there's no one more excited than I am to see North Carolina finally have a serious conversation about making its tax code meaningful and connected to the 21st century economy, right? So if we can find a way to lower rates, if we can find a way to expand the base, and if we can do that in a way that also allows us to pay the bills, I think everyone in North Carolina wins.
Okay, well said. Going to be the last word, at least on the first part of the program. And we actually need to get our guest in here because I know he's going to have a lot to say about this, especially around the skills gap. Before he comes out here, next week on this program, more education. Education seems to be a cornerstone in much more than economic development, and we're going to continue it. Fred Carter, Dr. Fred Carter from Francis Marion University in Florence will be our guest. Fred Carter was, and he's probably going to roll his eyes and say something to me next week for saying this, but he was chief of staff for Mark Sanford in South Carolina for a while, but he's recovering from that, and he will be talking about more around education and how important it is. And then the state of nonprofits and philanthropic initiatives. In 2 weeks, we will be focusing on that, and not just following the fiscal cliff, but in general, since 2008. How has that changed? We'll find out. Is 2013 going to be the year of the tech sector again? Well, is that where we'll find our competitive edge globally? And will all things new age and tech be a bright spot for growth? And in light of increasing reports about website hacking, how much of our risk is changing as we depend more and more on cloud computing. Joining us again is SciQuest Chief Executive Officer Stephen Wiehe. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Before we get into all those other things about tech, we were talking about education here. Skills gap.
Yes.
You hire software engineers. You hire high-paid, high-wage people. How wide is that skills gap, Stephen?
It is wide. It is difficult to hire people, and I think it's driven by a couple of things. It's a law of supply and demand. Within the triangle, there are a lot of people competing for the skills that we are also looking for. You have Red Hat, you have UBS, you have Fidelity, you have Deutsche Bank, you have IBM, and so there is a very active market for people looking for people with technical skills, technical competencies. This involves programmers, project managers, support analysts, but it all revolves around this technology environment. So the demand is there, the demand is growing, but at the same time is the pool is growing, but not at the same speed, not at the same rate or speed.
Mm-hmm. Question, Anita?
Steve, we've been talking a lot about whether we have enough people with the credentials that employers need. But I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is, are the people who have the credentials coming into your establishment with the right skill sets that they need? Are our educational institutions teaching kids what they need to be successful in your enterprise?
I think they are, but what we struggle in that a lot of the kids coming right out of school lack some of the very basic business skills that we end up having to spend a lot of time teaching. And so consequently, we tend to look for a little more mature or more experienced people. It doesn't mean that we can't hire them. It's just it's a cost-benefit discussion. I still think there is still a very strong demand for them, and so I think we need to create more of these types of skills and these students. But your point is very fair. It's a great question.
Yeah. You know, we've had conversations in the circles that I talk with around how do you develop those skills, and are those the responsibilities of public education, K-12, higher education? Is it a shared responsibility with the business, et cetera? Have even taken that conversation to the point of should we create tax incentives for internships or co-op based programs that would incentivize businesses to bring in young students all the way K-12 through colleges. What are your thoughts on that kind of a model?
I think it's a great question, and it's really a mixture of public and private. It cannot be entirely the responsibility of the public sector. I think they are handling enough responsibility already. It can also not be the entire responsibility of the private sector. And what I mean by that is, as we've looked at our skills gaps, we've looked at how do we fill them, and we thought about, does it make sense for us to do some of this training in-house? The challenge for us is it's going to be a lot of expense for us. We are going to teach them, and then after a year or two of getting them up and experienced, then I'm having to compete with everybody else to be able to keep the staff. And so therefore, from our very selfish point of view and my shareholders' point of view, the ROI becomes very tenuous. And so I think it's really a blend of public and private. I mean, we've had a lot of luck bringing interns into the organization. We do it on a very small basis, but it gives us a chance to give people experience and exposure. It gives us to bring in young blood into the business. But it's on such a small basis that the risk is limited. And being able to do that on a much wider scale, I think, is important. I mean, I struggle. I go through parts of the state, up in Warren County and Henderson County, and you see the lack of economic opportunity. And I would very much like to find ways to put those people to work. But then when I have to look at my responsibilities as being public and how we're held accountable for our shareholder value, it's difficult for us to find ways to do that entirely on our own.
Isn't there a way to reinsure that risk, though, Stephen? Couldn't you go to a community college system and say, listen, why help us out here? Let's start a program. Let's start a 3 to 5 year program. I know this is not a new idea, but if you're driving it and you're saying, I'm willing to put some money into this deal, and maybe I can get the students / apprentice to commit for a 2 to 3 year period, isn't there something you could put together? Well,
first off, it's difficult to get someone to commit because that's called slavery. You know, and so as much as you want to get them to do that, it is problematic. But we can solve that problem by making sure that we offer a good place and competitive wages and a great environment. It is something that we're interested in doing. The problem is I think it needs to be a much larger scale. To put this into context, this year we'll have hired about 120 people. And right now, this is in 2012, and right now I have about 40 open positions. And so my challenge is 30 or 40 or 50 people. Now, I do believe collectively across a lot of the other companies in the area, we can build a much bigger organization, and the money is there, but someone has to own the problem. And it feels like a cop-out that I don't own it, but it's just one of many challenges that we all have to work on.
May I ask a follow-up question here? Many people have said that perhaps the skills gap that we are facing is really a lack of awareness gap of young people, that as they're coming through the pipeline, there isn't a transparent, easily accessible way to understand where the economic opportunities and careers exist.
I agree completely.
Do you?
And I will do it for a couple of points. I have a son that's graduating high school right now, and so he's going through all of the career decision process of where he goes to school. And the discussions about what do you want to do, it's not about how are you going to support yourself. And there are plenty of opportunities, there's lots of opportunities to get a degree, but the question really is how relevant is that degree and how is it going to pay for itself longer term? And I think we need to spend more time with the students as they work their way through high school, helping them understand the economic environment so that they are in a position to make that as part of the calculus. I don't want to discourage anyone from having a degree in history or a degree in art, but I also need them to understand before they start the process that the economic opportunities are probably much limited, and therefore that should be part of the calculus that they make rather than, I think we find too often that these kids have gone through 4 years of school, and then they come out and then they start to look and then they realize how very difficult it is to get a degree in flute performance. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not opportunity out there, but it's a much smaller world. And I think we have to start that dialogue earlier in the process rather than later in the process.
And what role can the business community play in helping with that awareness? I recall once doing a presentation for a group of small town mayors, and I was going through here the 10 fastest growing occupations in North Carolina, and one of them came up to me and he said, you know, I'm the guidance counselor in my local school, and I sure wish somebody had shared that information with me beforehand, because I think I've been giving people the wrong advice for 25 years.
I think it's a fair point. I think it's all about, I think it's exposing the data in a way that's useful. I mean, I think we've been sitting here talking about there's a great opportunity in technology jobs. I think the average high school senior doesn't know what a technology job is.
I would agree.
I don't think they know. So what does that mean? What's the degree I have to get? What is the skills I have to have? What are 4 things I should do while I'm going to college to make myself applicable to take this great technology opportunity? And I think it's the lack of specificity that we need to spend more time helping them understand what that means and how to take advantage of it. I mean, to be very clear, I can't hire enough Java developers. I cannot hire enough .NET developers. And so I don't know if, and again, I don't mean to sound like I'm critical of the education process, but I don't know if and you're from NC State, I don't know how much time we're spending at NC State saying, guys, Java skills are very important, and because here is the opportunity. And I think we have to find a way to bring business and the education system together to have those dialogues in front of the students.
Absolutely.
Because I believe the more we educate people, they can make the decision. And I think it has to be very specific points and very specific data so that they can make the right choice. Does that make sense?
And I would take your comment a step further and ask you if you agree that I think it needs to start before they get to the university system or the community college system.
It needs to be in high school.
Absolutely.
Because there's so many young people who you ask them, you know, we've all been there, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they say, oh, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a nurse. And they realize, no, actually, they want to go into, you know, phlebotomy or something. There are all these allied health professions, and they've never heard the terminology. They don't understand what the working hours are of those career professions, what the flexibility is with some and not with others. And so I think we have an obligation as society and as the businesses to go before they get into college where they fine-tune.
So really, STEM has a PR problem.
It's a PR problem and a relevance problem. I think, so again, I have this son who's coming out of high school, and one of the things I had him do a couple of years ago was work during the summer. And in fact, he ended up working in SciQuest. And my experience, what I was trying to expose him to was, this is what business is like. And he will acknowledge he was pond scum, so he was basically doing the lowest level work possible. But I wanted him to see what that work entailed. I wanted him to meet developers. I wanted him to meet salespeople. Because then at the end of it, then he at least had some point of relevance or some perspective on it, rather than, I want to be in business like my dad, and he doesn't know what that means. Right. And so it's all about putting it into context and experiences that then the student can then take and move forward with, or make use of.
We've got less than a minute left. Let me just quickly ask you, Steve, we see all these headlines about websites being hacked and attacked and taken down. Has that increased in instances, and is the risk worse than it was before?
I don't think so. In fact, I think the risk is less. It's interesting because our technology, we deliver it as a software as a service, and so everything we offer is through the cloud. 10 years ago, when we were selling our products to Yale and to Harvard, we had a lot of questions and went through a lot of very detailed analysis and work with them to prove that we were safe. Today, now, as we sell our products, we get a lot less questions about it. People now are able to assume that we are safe and we're not at risk. But I think what's happened is, because of the proliferation of it, I think it's become more topical, and so people are talking about it. I think the risk has been there all along. It's no more, it's no greater. Okay. It's just more of it, and so we hear about it.
Thank you for being on the program again. Good to see you.
No problem.
Thank you. Cheryl, good to have you here.
Thank you, Chris.
Anita, always nice to have you here. Thank you.
Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.